if you go in thinking that you can sort of, that music is just about passion and inspiration, and that you can just sort of make something beautiful solely by being authentic, and that it doesn't require some sort of self-discipline or restraint, then I think you'll quickly find that you stagnate, because there's no, you have to be able to reach back to tradition and revitalize that to create something beautiful moving forward.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Saroof.
Today we're joined by ISI's Chief of Staff and our friend Spencer Kashmanian. He is our Chief of Staff, and he's also the lead pianist and I guess founder of the Spencer Cash, I think it's a quartet now, and he's a really good jazz pianist, and he talks a lot in the office about his study of the discipline of playing jazz and other thoughts on music. So we figured this would be a fun opportunity to talk with one of our colleagues about not only a fun topic and something, I guess, outside of the beaten path of what we would normally talk about on Conservative Conversations, but also something, that deeply touches on important questions of human flourishing, human happiness, the soul, and how that relates to political life and our culture. So, Spencer, good of you to join us. Thanks for being on Conservative Conversations.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about this. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart as a practitioner of jazz, as a musician, but also part of my never-ending quest, my crusade to help the right appreciate jazz a little bit more. So happy to do my part.
Awesome. And before we get started with our conversation, I'd like to thank our listeners for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. If you'd like to help join us in fulfilling our mission, be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. And to start off, Spencer, I'd love to hear how you got into jazz, what sort of drew you to it initially, maybe what you were listening to beforehand, and how you sort of maybe made a conversion to jazz, and maybe you could even also define like what jazz is.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, as long as I can remember, music has been a huge part of my life. There's a picture of me somewhere, I think maybe when I was 2 years old, with a set of headphones on, and my mom always says that I was listening to Beethoven in that photo. So music has always been part of my formation. And I studied classical piano growing up from elementary school through high school, and continued playing into college, although I didn't study music in college. But I went to school in New York City, and that is really where I started getting into jazz. I'd listened to jazz before, but in New York, of course, you have this abundance of jazz clubs, a really thriving jazz community there. And we can get into this, but it really is the type of music that benefits you to hear it live, to be there in person. And that's really how you apprentice in the craft of jazz. So I started getting into playing jazz when I was in New York. In fact, it just happened to be the case that my roommate played upright bass, and of course I played piano. So we sat down and started jamming, and the magic kind of happened from there. And now I live in Pennsylvania, and of course work at ISI. But I moonlight in the evenings as a jazz pianist, as a musician working in the Philadelphia area, the Delaware area, and love to do that. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Quite a good jazz pianist, I might add.
No, thank you.
And Spencer, so when I know commonly, I have listened to jazz quite a bit, and obviously we're recording this right as the Christmas season is kind of kicking off. So I actually wrote a piece like years ago. This was when I was writing for my campus like newspaper that was like non-affiliated with ISI, just the campus daily. And one of my first pieces that I wrote was about how great Christmastime is, because you get this revival every year and this appreciation for some of this older, and by older I mean maybe like 70-year-old music that you normally never listen to throughout the year if you're like a millennial or a Zoomer. So like Nat King Cole, Frank Sinatra, incorporating some of the elements of jazz music. And it struck me that, this is alongside rap, which as someone who listens to rap music, I know that's not like not like regularly, but I know that's not a popular, conservative opinion. Maybe among Zoomers it is, but I know like rap isn't what you think of when you think of, what conservatives like to listen to typically. But those are really great exports of American culture, jazz music and also rap. And I'm sure there's a lot of overlap between between the two, the advent of those two types of music. So could you lead us through kind of what the background of jazz music is, how it became this great, triumph of American culture and the American musical tradition?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right to bring up the season. I think Christmas is probably the ideal time to, get into jazz. Maybe if you're not a jazz listener, or maybe you're just a seasonal jazz listener and only listen to it around Christmas. But I think what is particularly helpful with this season is that you have a familiarity with the songs, and so you can, when you know the song, the underlying song structure, and then you listen to jazz musicians improvise on it, it's more enjoyable, it's more accessible. So if you know Jingle Bells or White Christmas, and actually just a couple days ago, I came across this recording of Charlie Parker playing. He did a radio broadcast where he played White Christmas. He's just playing a regular jazz set, and they asked him to play something Christmassy. And I was sitting there listening to it thinking, this would make a great introduction for anyone who's not familiar with jazz and how jazz works, because he plays the melody, he plays the chord changes, we would say, as a musician, of the song, and then he starts to improvise on it. He starts to elaborate on it and sort of explore the different corners and the structure of the song. And so anyone listening, I would encourage them, you could just find it on YouTube, look up Charlie Parker playing White Christmas, and it may make it a little bit more accessible for you if you're not familiar with jazz. But Marlo, to get to your question, it's really how jazz started. Jazz is rooted in the early 20th century, but really coming out of 19th century musical culture. New Orleans is considered the birthplace of jazz. You had in New Orleans a culture, there was sort of a mixture of, Catholic Spaniards, but also African-American slave culture there, trading culture. And music was so thoroughly involved in every part of their life in that city. Like many a great city, music was played at funerals, music was played at weddings, of course at church. And so that's really where jazz got its start, is that there was a music served, sort of social purpose in the city. And so there were people that you would sort of recognize as the jazz musicians paraded through the city. You'd recognize certain tunes they played. It was a musical culture. And then what happens is that music starts to get kind of exported over time up the Mississippi, eventually goes to Chicago, New York City. It's one of the things I love about jazz too, that I think is a distinctly conservative, we might say, facet of it, is that it's rooted in places. There are distinct jazz styles. There's New Orleans jazz, and it has a very specific sound. But then there's also New York jazz and Chicago jazz. There's Kansas City jazz. All of those have their own distinct traditions that emerge in the course of the 20th century. And some of the great practitioners of jazz you have coming out of that culture, of course, the first great hero is Louis Armstrong, who was a astounding musician and improviser. Later became famous primarily as a singer, kind of a pop singer, but in the early days of his career was known as primarily as an instrumentalist, as a trumpet player. And so jazz is tied to social function. I think is an important part of appreciating it. And then you have over time you might say the summit of jazz was the swing era in the 1940s, where you have jazz becomes both the most popular form of music in the country. People are dancing to it on college campuses and in ballrooms all across the country. But you also have this astounding level of musicianship among bands at that time, particularly bands like Benny Goodman's and Artie Shaw and later Glenn Miller. So that was sort of the summit of jazz's popularity. And then jazz devolves into, or I shouldn't say devolves, but evolves maybe is a better word, into the bebop era, and then hard bop. And that's those are musicians like Charlie Parker, and later leading into Miles Davis, Dexter Gordon, Dizzy Gillespie, and so on. So that's sort of the kind of a broad, 30-second version of the history of jazz and how it came about.
I want to pick up on that because the devolves word, I think, is, I guess, a little bit prescient.
I knew you would pick up on that, Tom.
Yeah, of course, because I listen to metal music, and jazz, I think, has more than rap or other styles of music. Jazz would be considered more, I guess, a conservative, I guess in our day, genre or something to listen to if you're going to sort of to make it a critique of music today. I don't think many people are saying, oh, jazz is where it all went wrong. They're more looking at, the more obscene things in rap music today, or the increasing stupidity of pop music, which maybe we can talk about that later. But like metal music gets a lot of brunt of that, especially on the right, especially amongst Christians. But I still think there are conservative elements. But I want to sort of flip the question back on the jazz thing, because if we're talking about sort of movements and evolution in music over time, especially popular music, jazz might be considered, at least in America, the sort of start of popular music as opposed to just straight out and out classical music. And so I'm familiar with Allan Bloom's chapter in The Closing of the American Mind on music, in which he doesn't really talk about jazz. He mentions this one very little passing remark that like someone would used to swing along in the 30s, and they'd sort of recognize what they were doing as slightly degenerate, but for the most part, they would see that and see classical as the high form of art rather than the low form. And his critique is that with rock music, you see the ascendancy of rock music, you see relativism in music, full stop, because there's this collapse between the high and the low. But I wonder what you think about where jazz fits into the more modern forms of popular music up against the classical 19th century, both in America and across the world, and sort of stylistically. I guess, what's your conservative case for jazz?
Yeah, it does have jazz. Has had a rocky relationship with the conservative movement. Maybe we can say that, and Bloom actually shares that with Richard Weaver, who was also critical of jazz, for example. Who I think at one point, called it a sign of our predilection for barbarism or something like that. And, usually I think that argument tends, maybe you could distinguish between two different arguments that they make. One is that there's maybe we call it the decadent argument, that they look back to Plato and they find something in jazz, musically speaking, that is kind of malforming the soul as you listen to it. The rhythms, let's say, the syncopation are sort of not good, and they're conducive to immorality and so on. And so maybe that's one argument we could set aside. And then the second argument, I guess, is there's definitely a conservative suspicion of the popularity of jazz, which is sort of funny to say now because jazz is sort of this niche thing. But particularly in the 40s through 60s, maybe when jazz was a little bit more popular, there was this suspicion of the popularity of it, because there is, and I think not entirely, I don't think this is entirely wrong-headed. I think there's a lot of truth in this, that if something is that popular, there may be that may be an indication that there's a kind of lowness or mediocrity to it. There's an opposition between high culture and low culture. But I guess I'd say in response to that, maybe taking the second argument first, is that I would actually make the case that jazz, especially maybe in the swing era, let's say, but I think in general jazz actually, if anything, a better analogy might be it kind of achieves Aristotle's mixed regime where in music, which is to say jazz is a music that is harmonically complex. It's rhythmically complex to play. Being a musician playing jazz, it's a complex music to play. But certainly when you do it right, and certainly if you're playing swing music. So again, going back to Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, it's also danceable. It's also accessible to sort of the common person just listening to it. And that's what I think made it so popular, along with external factors like record producing and the radio. I think that's also what contributed, obviously, to making jazz, the first great wave of popular music in America. It sort of coincided with the ability to record and distribute music, on a mass scale. But I think you see this marriage between it's complex. You have to study the craft in order to actually play this kind of music. It's virtuosic. It's technically demanding and impressive. And that's why when a jazz solo is just playing in a band, often they'll stand up and get some acclaim for that solo, and people will hoot and holler and cheer them on if there's a sort of something they play that is especially moving. But it's also accessible. Going back to Marlo's point, we all want to listen to Ella Fitzgerald around Christmas, or put on big band music, for certain occasions. So I guess that's tackling the second argument. Going back to the first, we could talk about this at length, but I think musically, I'm unconvinced by Allan Bloom and Richard Weaver say that that the rhythms in jazz, are actually corrupting spiritually somehow. Partly because I am a classically trained musician, and I've played quite a bit of classical music that have rhythms that are similar to what you encounter in jazz. And syncopation is, you can find syncopation in late Beethoven piano sonatas. You can find, a kind of harmonic lushness that has been criticized in jazz you find in Wagner. And so I'm unconvinced on a musical level by those arguments. I think maybe, which is not to say that I'm unconvinced by the broader argument, that I think there are kinds of music that can be spiritually corrupting, certainly. I just don't think jazz is one of them.
You mentioned popular music, and something I always, there's like these TikTok trends sometimes that go around about like, in 50 years from now, we'll be listening to like Kendrick Lamar and thinking back on it fondly, like our grandparents would think of like, someone who was popular in like the 1950s that brings back this nostalgia. And it's, we obviously think back on that type of music that our grandparents would be listening to with like, oh, that's so, sweet and sentimental. And obviously like the music that we listen to today, probably most of it could not be compared to that, whether it's just the quality of the music itself, which is often a product of a lot of different, there's a lot of synthetic and artificial intervention, and the amount of technology that goes into auto-tuning and all of these different aspects of it that kind of deprive music of the authenticity of music back in the day, I guess. But even like I know my neighbors who are like in their late 50s would really fondly look back on like Summer of '69, right? And like that's like their song. So how would you think of jazz music in the grand scheme of things, when, especially, when we're, maybe this is kind of like historicist in a sense, to use the phrase that, the Straussians really like to talk about, but can we think of music in a way that's separated from its objective quality, and how does that apply to jazz music? When we look at it now and say like, of course that's like conservative music, I guess. It's it has a lot of these features of it that are drawn from other musical traditions that seem to be in harmony with each other, whereas music today is, like Tom said, oftentimes obscene. It's oftentimes just really poor quality. Singers don't actually know how to sing. Oftentimes they're just like what people would call Nepo babies. So there's so many things that go into kind of perverting the musical experience because of that artificiality. So yeah, what's kind of your response to pop music and how we can think of jazz in that context?
Yeah, I do think that there is in jazz, there is this inbuilt conservatism that, that I think you picked up on, Marlo, that I don't think, maybe carries through as strongly to different styles of music, in particular rock, and sort of, and rap and maybe subsequent, new developments, let's say, in pop music. I don't think it's gone altogether, but I don't think it's as strong. And this is the strain that I have in mind, is that one thing you'll notice when you talk to jazz musicians is that they care a lot about what I would call musical genealogies, which is, who taught you, who did you learn from, who have you studied? So the way you actually learn jazz, they even do this in conservatories and jazz studies programs, is you transcribe the material of the masters that came before you. You actually have to sit there and listen, right? You just, and the old way to do this was like you had a record player or a tape player where you just kept skipping back until you could finally hear what was being played, and you wrote that down on your sheet music. You would transcribe it to learn the language, orally. And so there is this inbuilt veneration for the great masters of the craft who came before you. I don't think that carried through, at least, certainly not rhetorically, not, the spirit, I think, was sort of chucked out with 60s counterculture, where it just became much more about sort of a self-conscious rebellion, against not only just, I think as conservatives, we all agree, the social and moral mores of the broader culture, but that even happened in music. I think there was sort of a, you do perhaps even talk to a certain person of a certain age today who it's almost as though music didn't exist before 1960 for them. And which is interesting to me. There's this rupture. There's not, that I don't think is present in jazz so much, where there's jazz has a kind of hermeneutic of continuity that goes through it. I guess those are my thoughts on that. Marlo, does that answer your question?
Yeah. I guess it's, as a musician, what's your view on, just out of curiosity, and I think this could be of interest to people who are like me, where I don't really, honestly, I'm not perhaps Tom is a little bit more of a music buff than I am, but I listen to pretty much two kinds of music. I listen to 80s and 90s, or even before that, country music, and the Arabic music I adopted from my parents, and from the community I surround myself with is usually the Middle Eastern, Syrians and Levantine people. So I'm kind of detached from, I know pop music, but I also, in the larger scheme of American music, I sometimes think to myself, there's almost this stagnation that I sense with American music, but I'm sure we also see this with movies. I was talking to my husband about this the other day, where with Christmas movies, I wonder what the financial calculus of it ends up being, because every year you can count on people watching these same movies that show the best wholesome elements of American culture, with some cheeky humor there here and there. So I think of National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, it's just so Americana. Home Alone, 1 and 2, that America doesn't really exist anymore, and there's a reason why we still feel this nostalgia, even when we're not, if you're in your 20s, you probably don't remember that time, or were even alive during that time period anyways. And I wonder how much of that applies to music too, where I don't know how much novelties of cinema are coming out for the Christmas season anymore that really draw us to the theaters. Same, and maybe Barbie, not a Christmas movie, but I can think of that as being just total blockbuster. Everyone was this is amazing, right? But it also draws off of Barbie, which is a staple of American culture. So when we think of music, how much do you think that applies to? Is there stagnation? Do you sense a stagnation in music where there's not as much innovation happening on that front? Maybe there's a few artists here or there that seem to buck that trend, but overall, will there be a new jazz music, or am I just totally ignorant of new music cultures that are being created?
So I think it's interesting. There's a lot of talk about innovation in jazz and other styles of music today. In jazz, that's sort of the rhetoric of innovation. In fact, there's a saying that you'll hear sometimes, that innovation is the tradition of jazz. I actually disagree with that statement. I think what it gets wrong is that in any given age, the vast majority of musicians, even excellent musicians, aren't great innovators. You do have people like Charlie Parker and Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis later on that are great innovators in the music, but there are any number of musicians that were recording at that time and playing at that time that made beautiful music that wasn't at least self-consciously pushing the envelope. And so if anything, I do think you're right, Marlo, that I think we are seeing a kind of stagnation in music and probably in other arts. But what's strange to me about it is that it seems to actually be coupled with a lot of rhetoric about innovation and being countercultural and sort of, rebelling against traditional standards in the arts. And yet, there's a lot of rhetoric like that, but it's actually leading to a kind of stagnation. Personally, I think that actually has to do with that language of innovation and sort of, idolizing, breaking boundaries, even in the arts, actually leads to a kind of rejection of a craftsmanship mentality that you really need to have in the arts. That when you're practicing in art properly, it involves discipline, it involves deference to tradition. You're learning that there are, in fact, certain rules, certain boundaries that make something jazz or make it not jazz, or make something rock and make it not rock. There are sort of clear-cut boundaries to all these. They may be difficult to define at times, but there are certain rules to follow. And so I actually think that this kind of obsession at times with innovation and pushing the boundaries can lead to stagnation, because it, when you have the craftsmanship approach, your concern is to just do something excellently and something beautifully. And so in that sense, and I would say this about my day-to-day experience as a musician, it's actually much more like being a carpenter, where you're just sort of working, sort of carving away at something. And there are even elements of drudgery involved. You practice scales and arpeggios, and you practice chords, and you sort of do these repetitive things day in and day out, so that when you do play a show, you have all the tools at your disposal to then create something beautiful. That I think I see maybe in more broadly in the music industry is a kind of rejection of the patient craftsmanship approach that is required to actually master this language. And in a way I think that's actually leading to stagnation, because you're sort of you're then going into shows and into music producing with a greatly reduced, and perhaps in some cases even no tools on hand. You build those tools by sort of working at the things that I'm talking about. And I think if you go in thinking that you can sort of, that music is just about passion and inspiration, and that you can just sort of make something beautiful solely by being authentic, and that it doesn't require some sort of self-discipline and restraint, then I think you'll quickly find that you stagnate, because there's you have to be able to reach back to tradition and revitalize that to create something beautiful moving forward.
That's a really insightful point, and I feel like this entire conversation, that's a great point, because it's reminding me of this entire conversation is of Josef Pieper's book on leisure as the basis of culture. And when we were talking earlier about the idea of how music cultivates either forms or maybe malforms the soul, and sort of how Plato talks about that in his Republic, how you need physical education, but you also need musical education for the guardians in order to bring about good order and justice in political life, as we're sort of seeing all of these trends of decadence and, I guess, spiritual exhaustion in America, whether in our movies or the music, as we're talking about. It reminds me of like our inability now, according to Pieper, to really do leisure, to experience leisure. And what you were talking about, craftsmanship, because one of the things I'm trying to figure out or think about for myself is the relationship between craftsmanship or practice, and doing these sorts of things that are a retreat from the hustle and bustle and a lot of the noise that we hear today, whether that's on Twitter or on the news. How a retreat, or how, I guess, I don't know what the word is. Maybe I'll use retreating into some sort of craft or some sort of practice or some sort of art can allow us to experience leisure, and what the role leisure and cultivation and culture plays in some of the problems that we're having today in society, or some of the, what that might mean as an antidote to where we are now. I don't know. That's not exactly a question, but if you have a response or some pointers there.
Yeah, I think, it's almost as though we as conservatives, we're familiar with sort of this understanding of society. You've got the state, you have government, and then you have the individual, but you've got that crucial space in between, civil society, which is made up of churches and voluntary associations. And we know that a healthy, flourishing society requires a flourishing civil society. It's almost as though there's something similar, in operation at the individual and personal level, where you have, all of us have to earn our bread by the sweat of our brow, by going to work. And then maybe we could say that it's crucial to play, let's say, for lack of a better term, to have, sort of pure relaxation. But there's this crucial space in between, which I do think, Tom, you're right, that, to me anyway, it seems that this is something we're losing on a grand scale, and certainly in the West right now, is that crucial space in between is leisure, which is, it has elements of play to it, but it also has elements of work. And that when you're doing something like studying jazz piano or sculpture or learning a language, it is fulfilling, it's enjoyable at times, but also at times it can be a bit frustrating, because there are, going back to what I said before, rules that you have to follow. There are standards that make something, objectively, aesthetically right or wrong. And so there's this tradition that stands in judgment over you. And so any time, where someone stands, over us in judgment, that can be a little bit daunting too. And so I think it's one of the first things to go. And maybe you see a lot of people doing this in the West right now, I think, is jettisoning leisure, and the life just sort of becomes divided between work. And sometimes they work a lot and work many hours, but then that sort of just becomes a justification for when you stop doing, work, let's say servile labor, then it's, you just move on to play, but you're missing something vital, which is, it's dignifying and it's ennobling, for a human being. I mean, here I always think of Tolkien and Tolkien's remarks about, humans being sub-creators, that we are made in the image of a God who is first and foremost a creative God. He is the supreme creator. And so we are made in that image. We too, in order to be godly, it follows that to be godly as a human being is to create things. It's to write stories like The Lord of the Rings and create entirely new worlds. And in music, that's creating sonic worlds. It's writing symphonies. It's making jazz records. So we have this urge that I think if we suppress it, it's actually dehumanizing. But it's in a way it's almost divinizing, right? To create beautiful things, and so I think we're losing that by sort of crowding leisure out of our life.
That's a great point, and because I think like leisure, if you're looking at Pieper, he's arguing at once against the people who treat leisure as just leisure equals non-work. He actually sees it as a positive thing that you actually have to work at, and that can be frustrating. Like, prayer or, the reason you have a holiday is because there's something divine or something transcendent to which we are connected. And that's not always easy. That's actually often very difficult if you're talking about prayer or celebrating a mass or doing some, Lectio Divina, whatever it might be. That's something that you have to work at or practice. Same thing with music, same thing with other forms of leisure. I think like carpentry is a hobby, since you brought up carpentry, or like other sort of, I guess, servile things that could be used for commodification purposes that you might do as a hobby. These are all practices that you have to cultivate. And it seems to me that a lot of our, entertainment today, and so this is something that Bloom talks about. This is how he opens his chapter on music, is that music has taken on an all-encompassing ethos. I'll be with my friends or family and I'm just thinking about music because that's all I want to be around. It's sort of a new god in a way. I wonder if a lot of our entertainment is really a function of the fact that we are bored and we've lost leisure and the ability to really partake in something higher or transcendent. And this is, I think, one of the main crises of the West is not the death of Christianity, it's still alive and well, but the ascendance of a secular culture as opposed to and apart from Christianity. So I guess my question for you is, and as we're thinking about the idea of recovering or bringing back a sense of cultivation, from your perspective as a jazz musician, as an avid jazz listener, maybe some of our listeners want to get into jazz, what would you say, not only in the jazz space, but more widely, but how people can appreciate jazz, how people can start to recover a sense of doing the work that's required to, cultivate leisure again?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because in some sense, when I go back and read Allan Bloom talking about this, in a way, I'm actually kind of jealous of. I think he was writing in the late '80s, maybe, and I find myself sort of jealous of that time period, because he says that the only thing that these students take seriously is music. I'm not sure that's true today. I think actually we don't take music very seriously. I think we hear a lot of music, but don't listen to a lot of music. That would be my observation more broadly, is that music, and Roger Scruton writes eloquently about this, that pop music sort of assaults our ears at every twist and turn. We go into a restaurant or the grocery store, and you just sort of always hear music playing. But what that can lead to is a relationship with music where you're never really intentionally listening to it. So the first thing I would say is actually set aside time to practice intentional listening to music, which is, and this is where it can be really helpful to maybe even, go old school and get something like a record player that sort of crowds out, digital distractions. And you say, look, I'm going to sit down, just like I would sit down and watch a movie with my spouse or my kids. I'm also going to sit down on the couch and take, half an hour, 40 minutes to listen to a Beethoven symphony or to listen to this Art Blakey record. And I'm going to really listen to it. And you will, by practicing that kind of a musical encounter, I guarantee over time, and you could just, pick a piece of music and say, I'm going to do that every night for a week. Or maybe you do it once a week, and in my family, we have kind of a tradition where I have young children that are all under the age of 6. And so we do Music Monday in our house where, most of the week we sort of read stories before bed and do the normal bedtime routine. But on Mondays, we actually, after dinner, we sit on the couch and we put on a piece of music and everyone just has to listen to that. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about it beforehand, but just like we would watch a movie, you sit down and listen to music, and that'll get you accustomed to following what I would say is, kind of the structure and syntax of a different piece of music. So practice really intentional listening. And I could share some specific listening, recommendations maybe for someone who wants to get into jazz. Maybe I could do that if you're interested. One thing I'll say, going back to a point you made early on in your question, is that I do think we've also lost this sense that music, part of the reason Plato saw the potency, the power of music is that in ancient Greece, and in fact, most of the history of the West, there was this understanding that music, like any other art form, like sculpture, like painting, that it expresses something deep and true and permanent about reality and about the structure of the cosmos itself. So this saying that you hear sometimes, the music of the spheres, that goes back to ancient Greece and the Pythagoreans, and there really was a belief that music, that the intervals in music, that when you played a triad chord on the piano or you played a fourth or a sixth, these different intervals, that in some way, some mysterious way, the reason why they sounded harmonious or the reason why they sounded discordant is because they were echoing some kind of intervallic structure in the universe itself. So they really thought that there was a kind of music that was being produced by the movements of the planetary bodies, the celestial bodies, and that music, was either beautiful or discordant, to the degree that it actually properly expressed those intervals in the cosmos itself. But that is something that we've lost. Now there is just, I think, and maybe you could argue about this. I'm no expert in this. You could locate the beginnings of this in Romanticism. Maybe it's later. Maybe it's not until modernism, postmodernism. Certainly, I think broadly what you've seen in the West is we've lost this sense that music is actually representational, like the other arts. It's very easy to see how painting is representational because you're painting reality, you're painting a portrait of someone or so on. It's very easy to see how sculpture is representational. It's not as easy with music, but which has led to, I think, now an understanding that music is, or a view that music is just about self-expression and sort of being passionate and play what you feel, man. That actually is a pretty radical departure from most of Western history and the West's relationship to music. That music actually is representational in the sense that it's expressing the music of the spheres, some order in the universe. And so we've lost that, and that's something that we have to recover. And so one way we can do that, again, is by practicing intentional listening to music. And second of all, I would say listen to music in person. Don't just only listen to recordings, but try to, if you don't play music yourself, invite people into your home who do play instruments or sing, and listen to music in person and make it communal, because that's a very different experience than just listening to, something that's on a streaming service.
Well, those are all great recommendations, Spencer. And I think this is a great place where we can wrap up. So if people want to follow more of your work, if people want to hear you play, what would you recommend to our listeners to find more of your stuff?
Yeah, sure. If you want to follow my own musical adventures, probably Instagram is the best place to get connected. And that's at Spencer Cash Piano. That's Kash, Spencer Cash Piano. So you can find me there. There's probably some stuff on YouTube as well if you search my name. If anyone who's in the broader Philly and Delaware region certainly is welcome to come out and hear me play sometime.
Awesome, and I also recommend that. It's always a fun evening, Spencer. So thank you again, and thank you to our listeners for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to head over to our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.